You really thought she'd stay with a man like you? The words cut through the dim glow of the bar lights. My best friend Ethan's voice, booming loud enough for every stranger in that Nashville dive to hear. His arm draped casually over my wife Claire's shoulders as if mocking the very foundation of my life. And the way the crowd went still for half a beat before the whispers broke out around me was the kind of humiliation you don't recover from quickly. Not when you see your partner of 12 years standing beside the man who'd been your brother in all but blood, smirking at you with the kind of cruel satisfaction people usually reserve for private revenge fantasies. Not public executions, and I swear I could feel the heat rising up the back of my neck while my hands clenched around the half-empty glass of whiskey I'd been nursing, the amber liquid trembling as if it too knew I was 1 second away from hurling it across the room. Before we get deeper into this story, make sure you're subscribed, and tell us in the comments where in the world you're listening from. My name's Daniel Carter. I'm 38 years old. Born and raised just outside of Louisville, Kentucky, though I've been living in Nashville for the past decade, building my architecture firm from the ground up, a company that now designs half the upscale developments in this city. The same company Ethan had been my right-hand man in since the very first blueprints were drawn on cheap drafting paper at a diner booth over too much coffee and not enough money, and in that moment I kept telling myself to breathe, to not let them see me unravel, because while they thought they had taken everything that mattered, I still had one card up my sleeve. Something so small and unassuming that no one in that room could have possibly guessed how it would one day burn their entire little fantasy world to ashes. That bar wasn't just any bar either. It was Miller's Tavern, an old joint on 8th Avenue where construction workers, artists, and white-collar execs all rubbed elbows under the same sticky ceiling fans. And the irony that Ethan chose that place, knowing it had been the first spot Claire and I had gone for drinks when we were barely more than broke kids chasing dreams, felt like he wasn't just flaunting her. He was rewriting my history in front of an audience, cutting the ribbon on his victory parade using my memories as confetti. I didn't throw the glass, though God knows I wanted to, and I didn't yell back or beg her to explain. No. I just swallowed the metallic taste of betrayal that coated my tongue, and I stared at them long enough that silence settled back over the room. The kind of silence where even the jukebox seemed hesitant to break it. And then I turned and walked out without a word. Because if there's one thing my father taught me, it's that revenge isn't about noise. It's about patience, like the way he used to carve those little wooden horses in the shed behind our house, slow, deliberate strokes until the shape emerged, and you realized the whole time he knew exactly what it was meant to become, and I promised myself right then that Ethan and Claire would become my unfinished carving. The truth is, Ethan and I went back farther than Claire and I ever did. We met freshman year at the University of Kentucky, two ambitious kids who thought they were too clever to play by anyone's rules, pulling all-nighters not for exams but for pitches to imaginary clients, sketching ideas on napkins in between beers at the Tin Roof. And when I landed that first real commission for a strip of boutique stores off Shelbyville Road, he was the first person I called, because I knew talent when I saw it, and I thought loyalty was the glue that kept men like us together. And Claire came later, senior year, when she sat 2 rows ahead of me in an art history lecture and scribbled little notes in margins like the world would fall apart if she didn't annotate every detail. And I remember thinking I wanted a life with that kind of attention to detail, and somehow I got it, or I thought I did, until Ethan made me realize I'd been living in someone else's script. The night at the bar wasn't the beginning, though. It was just the unmasking, and maybe that's what stung most. Because once you start pulling at threads, you realize how many things you ignored, how many late nights at the office were really just excuses, how many girl trips to Asheville and Charleston were just the same script Ethan had been given to repeat. And suddenly, every laugh they'd shared at our dinner table felt like a rehearsal for this final act. But in that first wave of humiliation, when people looked at me like the pitied husband, the fool who didn't see it coming, I refused to give them the ending Ethan wanted, because if there's one thing I've learned designing buildings, it's that you never reveal the foundation until it's ready to carry the weight, and I already had something tucked away that they didn't know about, something that would matter when the time came to balance the books between us. On my way home that night, I drove past Broadway where the neon guitars and cowboy hats tried to drown out the quiet devastation inside me, but I noticed one thing tucked into the glove box of my truck. An old silver drafting pen my father had given me when I started the firm, engraved with my initials. The same pen Ethan had signed our partnership agreement with. The same pen I'd once joked was lucky because every major deal I'd closed seemed to end with its weight in my hand, and though it probably looked like nothing more than an old writing tool to anyone else, in that moment I realized it was going to be the symbol of my revenge, the witness to both the betrayal and the reckoning that was coming. And so when I finally pulled into the driveway of the house Claire and I had built together on a quiet street lined with dogwoods, the house that had my fingerprints on every design choice from the vaulted ceilings to the hidden reading nook under the stairs, I sat there in the dark truck cab and let myself cry once, just once, because I knew once morning came there'd be no room for it anymore. Not if I wanted to play this right. Not if I wanted to make them feel every ounce of what they had just dumped on me in front of 100 strangers. And by the time I walked inside and heard the faint echo of her perfume still lingering in the bedroom, I had already decided the man who walked out of Miller's Tavern wasn't going to be the same man who eventually stood over Ethan and Claire when the tables turned. The weeks after that night felt like living in the aftermath of a tornado, the kind where your house might still technically be standing, but every window is shattered and the air tastes of insulation and dust. And while Ethan and Claire strutted around Nashville like some twisted power couple straight out of a bad soap opera, I played my part as the humiliated man licking his wounds, showing up to the office with tired eyes, keeping my head down at client dinners, even letting Ethan take more of the spotlight in presentations, because I knew the more he believed he had broken me, the more reckless he would become, and the more the city whispered that Daniel Carter had been replaced by his own right-hand man, the more determined I became to let them all underestimate me, because underestimation was the most powerful mask of all. I didn't confront her, not at first, not in the way people expected. Instead, I quietly moved my things into the small guest house behind the property, telling neighbors who asked that Claire and I were working through things. And while she seemed content parading Ethan around town, she didn't even try to hide the fact that she was draining our joint accounts faster than I could move funds out, booking spa retreats and luxury trips as if humiliating me publicly hadn't been enough, as if she wanted to bankrupt me too. And Ethan was all too happy to sign off on company cards for client entertainment that I knew damn well were just expensive dinners and hotel suites for the two of them. But I let them, because the more rope you hand someone who thinks they're in control, the faster they make their own noose. I'd see them sometimes, always accidentally, the way Nashville's social circles make sure secrets don't stay secrets. Like at a charity gala for the symphony where Claire showed up in a dress I recognized from a box I once gave her on our anniversary, and Ethan's hand never left her waist as they laughed too loud near the silent auction table. Their performance so exaggerated I almost wanted to laugh, because I realized something that night. They weren't just betraying me, they were feeding off the audience, needing the validation of others to make it real, and people like that always make mistakes when the applause starts to fade. The small win came a few days later. In the most unexpected way, a client I had worked with for years pulled me aside after a design review and said, "Damn, between you and me, I only trust you. Ethan talks too much. Something about him feels off." And though I just smiled and brushed it off, inside I felt the faint flicker of hope, the reminder that no matter how much they thought they had rewritten my life, some people still remembered the truth of who I was. But that hope was snuffed out almost immediately when I returned home to find a thick envelope shoved into the mailbox. Divorce papers already filed with Claire's signature neatly scrawled across the bottom, and stapled on top a note written in Ethan's smug handwriting that said, "Don't fight it. She's mine now, move on." That night, sitting at the kitchen table of the guest house, divorce papers spread out in front of me like some grotesque trophy of their conquest. I felt something crack, not the part of me that still loved her, that had already been burned to ash, but the part that believed I had to play fair, the part that thought dignity meant staying quiet, and I realized that if they wanted to drag me into a war, they had already underestimated the one advantage I had: knowledge, patience, and the silver drafting pen resting on the table beside those papers, the same one Ethan had forgotten about, the same one he once used to sign not just partnership agreements, but also side contracts, quiet deals, little shortcuts he thought no one would ever bother to dig through. The truth is, I had been quietly preparing long before I ever saw them at Miller's Tavern, back when I first noticed inconsistencies in our accounts, late-night transfers Ethan couldn't explain, and though I wanted to believe it was just sloppy bookkeeping, something in me had started keeping copies, small backups, a trail of breadcrumbs that would one day mean everything. Still, the setback of those papers hit me hard, harder than I expected, because while revenge was sweet in theory, in practice I was still a man sitting alone in a guest house eating cold Chinese takeout, while the woman I had built a life with laughed in the arms of the man I once trusted more than a brother. And it's hard to sleep when every creak of the house sounds like memory clawing back to remind you that once upon a time, love lived here. I'd wake up at 3 a.m., staring at the ceiling fan, hearing echoes of her laughter that weren't there, and for a while I wondered if maybe they really had one, if maybe the story was over before it began. But then I'd roll over, open the drawer of the knitstand where I kept those copies, those little fragments of truth, and I remember, no, this was just the intermission, the part of the play where the audience thinks the hero is gone, only to find out he's been standing in the wings the whole time. Ethan and Claire thought they were rewriting the script, but they hadn't realized I was the one holding the master draft. And so I began to watch them with a colder eye. Every dinner, every outing, every transaction that crossed my desk, and I started to notice patterns, little tells that gave away their desperation. Like how Claire suddenly insisted on selling the lake house up in Kentucky, the one we bought as an investment property, or how Ethan began pushing for faster timelines on projects, eager for cash flow that didn't quite match the numbers, and I thought to myself, they're not building a life, they're burning through one, and all I had to do was wait until the fire reached the foundation. They believed they were tightening the noose around me with divorce papers, company whispers, and public humiliation, but what they didn't see was that every step they took deeper into their fantasy was one step closer to the trap I was quietly setting, and though some nights I still felt the sting of loss like an open wound, other nights I felt a darker comfort. The kind that comes from knowing patience isn't weakness, it's precision, and one day soon, the same pen that signed our beginning would sign their end. By the time spring settled over Nashville, with the dogwoods blooming white against the cracked sidewalks and the smell of barbecue smoke drifting through backyards on Saturdays, I had already started threading the noose they didn't even realize was tightening around their necks, and the cruelest part was how much of it relied on their own arrogance. Their need to flaunt every move as if humiliating me wasn't just a byproduct, but the entire sport. The ticking clock came in the form of our company's annual shareholders' review, a meeting that Ethan had been boasting about for months, bragging to anyone who would listen that he and Claire would be unveiling a new vision for Carter and Holly architecture, conveniently dropping my name from the branding in his speeches like I was already an afterthought, and though I smiled and nodded in meetings, quietly signing off on budgets he barely glanced at. I knew this review would be the stage where he tried to finally erase me. What he didn't know, what he could never have guessed, was that for every move he thought he made unchecked, I was already 3 steps ahead, because tucked away in the safe of the guest house I now called home was a meticulously organized portfolio of evidence, false expense reports, shell invoices, wire transfers, routed through shadow accounts Ethan had sworn only he knew about, and each document bore his scrawled signature. Written with my old silver drafting pen, the one he never realized left behind a distinct pressure pattern I could trace back like a fingerprint, a detail so small he'd never thought twice about it, but one day that detail would prove everything. Still, patience doesn't erase pain, and every day leading up to that review felt like walking through glass barefoot, because Claire wasn't satisfied with betrayal in silence. She seemed to take joy in making sure I saw her at every turn, showing up at restaurants she knew I loved, sliding her hand into Ethan's as if daring me to say something. And the worst was Easter Sunday when she showed up at her mother's church with him in tow. The same pew I used to sit in with her, the same congregation that had watched us exchange vows 12 years ago. And when I walked in alone, late and hesitant, I caught the way people looked at me, pity in their eyes, whispers darting like fish through water, and for a moment I almost faltered, almost felt like giving up the charade of strength. But then Ethan leaned close to Claire and whispered something that made her laugh too loud. And in that laugh I heard the sound of victory they thought they had already secured. And I clenched my jaw so hard my molars ached, because I knew their confidence was the exact fuel I needed to keep going. The small reveals came like breadcrumbs scattered through those months. An email forwarded by accident that showed Ethan pitching a design I had drawn years ago, as if it were his, a phone call from a vendor hinting that Ethan was late on payments despite Claire's expensive shopping habits, a hushed conversation overheard in the office lobby about cutting Dan out clean. And though none of it surprised me, each piece slotted neatly into the larger puzzle I was building, a puzzle whose final picture would only become clear to them when it was far too late to undo it. I knew Ethan well enough to predict that his ego would drive him to overreach at the shareholders' review, to try to paint me as dead weight, the relic holding back his vision. And I also knew Claire well enough to know she'd be standing there, perfectly styled, eyes sharp as razors, feeding off the theater of it, and I promised myself that when the curtain rose, I'd let them have their moment. I'd let them bask in their little empire before showing them how quickly empires fall when the foundation is built on lies. There were nights when doubt clawed at me, when I wondered if revenge was worth the hollow ache that sat in my chest every time I walked past the main house, its windows glowing with light I no longer belonged to, but then I'd sit at the drafting table in the guest house, the one I had dragged out of storage, and run my fingers over the silver pen resting beside the evidence folders. And I'd remind myself of my father's words. A structure is only as honest as its foundation, Danny. Build it on lies, and it will collapse. Ethan and Claire thought they had built something honest. Love, power, a future. But I knew better. I knew their foundation was rotten, and all I had to do was wait for the right moment to strike the final blow. The closer we got to the review, the more reckless Ethan became, cornering me in hallways with smug smiles, dropping lines like, "You'll thank me when you're free of the stress." Or worse, "Claire's happier now than she ever was with you." And though every word felt like salt rubbed into an already open wound, I bit my tongue, smiled faintly, and let him believe I was broken. Because nothing disarms a predator faster than thinking his prey has already given up. Then came the night before the shareholders' review, when the city was quiet except for the occasional rumble of cars down West End Avenue, and I sat alone at the drafting table with the evidence spread before me, double-checking every file, every signature, every timestamp, and I caught myself whispering out loud, "They won't see it coming," because the truth was, even as confident as I felt, a part of me was still stunned that the same man who once swore we'd build something lasting together had been so blind, so sloppy, so consumed by his need to take what was mine that he hadn't realized he'd been signing his confession with every flourish of that silver pen. The irony was too poetic, too perfect, and though no one else in the world might notice, I would, and in the end, that would be enough. When dawn broke the next morning, painting the sky a soft pink over the Nashville skyline, I dressed in the same suit I'd worn to my wedding, a small act of defiance, a reminder to myself that while they thought they had taken everything sacred, I could reclaim even this. And as I slipped the pen into the inside pocket of my jacket, I felt its weight like a loaded weapon, not of violence, but of truth, and I knew this was it. The culmination of months of humiliation, patience, and quiet preparation. Ethan and Claire believed the shareholders' review would be their coronation, but what they didn't realize was that I had been building a stage of my own, one where their every lie would be spotlighted, their every betrayal exposed. And as I locked the guesthouse door behind me, I caught my reflection in the glass, a man who looked older, sharper, scarred but unbroken, and I thought they wanted me buried. But what they didn't understand was that I had been planting seeds all along, and today, those seeds would finally bloom. The conference room at the Omni downtown was packed wall to wall with investors, clients, junior architects in pressed suits who looked like they hadn't slept in days. And when I walked in, I could feel the shift in the air, the way whispers rippled across the crowd like the low hiss of a snake, pity, curiosity, maybe even a little amusement that I had dared to show up at what everyone assumed would be my funeral. And at the head of the long mahogany table stood Ethan, sharp navy suit, hair slicked back like he was auditioning for the role of conquering king, and beside him Claire, radiant in emerald silk, her hand grazing his shoulder as she leaned in to whisper something in his ear. Their choreography so rehearsed it made my stomach twist, but I smiled, nodded at familiar faces, and took my seat quietly at the far end. The pen heavy in my pocket like a heartbeat I was determined to keep steady. Ethan opened the meeting with the swagger of a man who believed the story was already written, rolling through slides about restructuring, about new leadership direction, peppering the room with digs so thinly veiled they were practically neon signs. The past has held us back, but the future is bold, and we need strength at the helm, not sentimentality. And every time he spoke, Claire looked at him with the kind of pride she used to reserve for me, the kind that said he wasn't just taking my business, he was taking my identity, rewriting me into a cautionary tale. I let him run the show, let the applause trickle through the room as he wrapped up with a flourish about Carter and Hale becoming Hale Design. The name switch alone a blade to the ribs, and just as he raised his glass of sparkling water and mock toast, I leaned forward, my voice calm but carrying through the air, That's a hell of a vision, Ethan. Only problem is it's built on fraud. The room froze, chairs squeaking, forks dropping against plates, eyes widening as all attention snapped to me, and Ethan's smirk faltered just enough for me to catch it, that half second where the predator realizes his prey has teeth. Slowly, deliberately, I pulled the leather folder from my bag and slid it onto the table, flipping it open so the top page stared back at him. An invoice for a non-existent consulting firm, signed in his handwriting, time-stamped on a night I had proof he was in Charleston with Claire. "You want to erase me?" I said evenly. "You might want to erase the paper trail first." He laughed, too loud, too forced, trying to brush it off. "Desperate, Dan. You really think anyone's going to believe?" But I cut him off by pulling the silver drafting pen from my pocket and clicking it once, the sound sharp in the silence, and laying it beside the pages. Every fraudulent expense, every forged signature, traced back to this pen. The same pen you used to sign our founding documents. The same pen you thought was just a tool. Turns out, Ethan, it's a witness. There was a ripple of confusion in the room as I pulled out the expert analysis I had commissioned weeks earlier, a document proving the unique indentation patterns of that pen's nib, and as I laid side-by-side comparisons, the partnership agreement, the fraudulent invoices, the fake transfers, gasps spread, people craning their necks, whispering to each other. Ethan tried to bluster, tried to pivot, but then Claire, in her desperation to maintain control, snapped at him under her breath, loud enough for those nearest to hear, "I told you not to use that damn pen." And in that single slip the facade cracked, because suddenly it wasn't just my word against his, it was her confirming everything with one careless outburst. The board members leaned in, brows furrowed, the weight of potential scandal settling on their shoulders, and I knew right then the trap had sprung exactly the way I designed it. Their greed, their arrogance, their need to humiliate me had made them sloppy, and now the very object they once thought of as meaningless had become the key to their undoing. But I wasn't done, not yet, because the double twist wasn't just that Ethan had defrauded the company, it was that I had already been quietly transferring my shares into a separate holding trust, a trust legally protected from divorce proceedings, a trust Claire couldn't touch, and when I produced the final set of documents showing that effective that morning, thanks to a silent partner I had brought in months ago, I was no longer just a minority voice in the room but the majority shareholder. The silence turned into stunned disbelief. "You wanted to erase me," I said, voice steady. "But what you didn't know is that while you were busy stealing, I was busy building. And as of now, Carter & Hawley isn't yours to rebrand. It's mine. Still mine. Always mine." Ethan's face went pale. Claire's hand slipped off his arm, and I could see in their eyes the dawning horror that everything they thought they had stolen was nothing but smoke, that while they paraded their betrayal like a trophy, I had been working in the shadows, meticulous, patient, waiting for this exact stage to turn their triumph into ashes. The fallout was immediate: board members demanding answers, investors whispering about lawsuits, a compliance officer already dialing his phone for an emergency audit, and Ethan, the man who once strutted like a king, looked like a schoolboy caught cheating on an exam, sweat beading on his forehead as he fumbled for words that wouldn't come. Claire, for all her elegance, tried to salvage dignity, tried to play the victim with tears forming at the corners of her eyes, but when she reached for Ethan's hand, he pulled it back. His first act of self-preservation, and I thought to myself, fitting. That's what you get when your empire is built on betrayal. The loyalty you stole collapses the moment the fire gets hot. I didn't raise my voice, didn't gloat, didn't need to, because the pen lying between us on the table said everything that needed to be said. Gleaming in the overhead light like a sword of judgment, and as I gathered my papers, sliding them back into the folder, I caught Ethan's eye one last time and whispered, just for him, "You wanted to humiliate me. Congratulations. Now the whole city gets to watch you burn." Walking out of that conference room into the bright Nashville sun felt like stepping out of a crypt, the weight of months lifting with every breath, and though people stared, though whispers followed me down the hall, it wasn't pity anymore, it was awe, shock, maybe even respect. By the time I reached the street, my phone was buzzing with messages, colleagues, old friends, even competitors reaching out, not with condolences but congratulations. And I realized then that revenge hadn't just leveled the playing field, it had rewritten the narrative entirely. Ethan and Claire would spend months tangled in lawsuits, their reputations shredded, their finances drained by legal fees, their love story collapsing under the pressure of survival. And me? I had my company, my name, my freedom. But more than that, I had something they could never take back. The knowledge that the symbol of their victory, the silver pen they once mocked as old-fashioned, had become the exact weapon of their destruction. That night, back at the guest house, I poured myself a glass of bourbon, the good kind my father used to sip on the porch after long days, and I set the pen down on the table in front of me, staring at it as the ice clinked in the glass. It wasn't just a tool anymore. It was a reminder that betrayal might wound, might scar, but it also sharpens, it teaches, it prepares. Claire and Ethan thought they had written the ending of my story, but what they didn't know was that they were just the setup, and I was the one holding the final draft. As I leaned back in the chair, sipping slowly, I realized I wasn't just free of them. I was free of the version of myself that needed them. The revenge wasn't just about destroying them, it was about reclaiming me. And that, in the end, was the sweetest justice of all. If you enjoyed this story, please give a thumbs up to the video and consider subscribing to the channel for more powerful true life stories.